In 2013, did you become aware that Jennifer Hasselbergen was urging Archbishop Neinstadt to appoint somebody else, somebody other than you, to be the delegate for safe environment?
No. I'd been awaiting that change since 2008.
Did you become aware that she was advocating the reporting of Shelley to law enforcement so that the same mistake would not be repeated that you had made concerning Waa Meer?
I think we talked about that a little earlier. Yeah.
Did you become aware of that?
I think I became aware of it through a media report.
And do you recall any discussions with Archbishop Neinstadt or Laird or any of the other officials where you and Hesselberger are having a dispute about whether to report and what should be reported?
I recall disputes between Jennifer Hasselberger and myself, but not about whether and what to report.
Your disputes were over disclosure to the parishes, weren't they?
No. Disputes were over matters of reviewing policies.
She was urging more disclosure to the parishes than what had been done, and you were urging less.
She may have been. I don't recall that she and I ever disagreed in that regard.
She was urging a disclosure to law enforcement, and you were urging against it.
I don't believe we ever disagreed on that.
Prior to 2008, why didn't you use email?
Because, first of all, I think we talked about this morning, and I may have used it in 2007. I had the privilege of having extensive support personnel. I did not feel competent. My little throwaway line when my friends would hassle me about it was to say, good, here's another way not to be able to reach me. Because I wanted to stay as current as I could on written correspondence and phone calls. I've since learned the convenience of email, but I resisted it for many years.
You're aware that the Archbishop controls all the funds held by the Archdiocese and its corporations?
I wouldn't characterize that. I wouldn't agree with your characterization.
The Archbishop has control over the fundings provided to the parishes, does he not?
No.
In 1992, the Catholic Community Foundation was created and funded, was it not?
It was created, yes, and then subsequently funded, still is being funded in various ways.
And the Archdiocese contributes funds to that.
I doubt that's true.
That is a fund controlled by whom?
By the board of directors.
And were you aware of any discussions had that was created to limit liability or exposure for sexual abuse claims that were then imminent and pending?
Yes.
Tell me about that.
We did a feasibility study. I worked with the group that did the feasibility study. The donors said, we're concerned about two major issues. Number one, we don't particularly trust bishops to make good decisions about long-term funds. With the campaign in 1990, what became the campaign in 92, but we began a feasibility study in about 1990 or 91. In the feasibility study, they said, we don't trust bishops not to spend money. There's all sorts of history of bishops doing that without proper controls. And secondly, we don't trust that you will not be forced by a court to surrender such funds if we give them to you, so we will not give them to you. So Archbishop Roach proposed the notion that the community itself set up a fund, a foundation for the service, for the support of Catholic services. And that's what happened. And I was very much part of it. I think I was the original incorporator.
And to your knowledge, is the Archdiocese moving any money or taking any action in anticipation of bankruptcy filing?
Not to my knowledge.
As long as you're pausing, may I ask what our time situation is?
Currently, we're at 58 minutes, 50 seconds.
In terms of time,
I'm trying to figure my math out.
okay.
Okay.
Off the video record at 5:23 p.m.
We-
Back on the video record at 5:24 p.m.
Okay, I'm informed by council that their calculation is we have 15 minutes left. According to their interpretation. And so I'd like to turn to Clarence of Aabra for a moment. In the 1990s, it's reported, it is reported that he is writing sexual letters to an inmate. Are you familiar with that scenario?
Yes.
And you were involved in him being sent to St. John Vianney for an evaluation the Archdiocese paid for?
I don't recall where he went to for evaluation, but I do recall we sent him, yes. And I was involved in that, yes.
And did you also then become aware that through that evaluation that he admitted to sexually molesting children on an Indian reservation in South Dakota?
I did learn that in 2002 or 3.
And Aabra, notwithstanding that admission, was allowed to work in until 2003, when the Clergy Review Board looked at his file and determined he had violated the charter. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And Aabra was given extra payments until 2004, when he reached this age of Social Security, correct?
I don't recall that, but that would be consistent with the other things we've talked about today.
On a list maintained by the Archdiocese and not made public until pressure by us and others, he was one who was deemed to have been credibly accused, correct?
Yes.
And his
Well, I should say, let me say, I don't know what the Archdiocese was listing. I believe that his admission of sexual abuse of minors or of a minor was true. So I don't know about the construction of an archdiocesan list, sorry.
Okay. In any case, his name was not made public until Minnesota Public Radio reported it in November of 2013, as far as you know, correct?
When he stepped down in 2003, he told his parishioners that he was stepping down not only because he'd reached retirement age, but because he had committed errors in the past, or some such phrase. That's as close as there was to disclosure.
In the case of John McGrath, did you become aware that after reports of his abuse became known, that you had recommended to Archbishop Roach that they not follow the policy in connection with how to handle him?
No. Matter of fact, I went and had a rather large public meeting at the parish to disclose the complaint. So I'm very surprised by your characterization. As a matter of fact, one of his good friends, one of our priests, accused me of killing McGrath because I forced him to disclose claims that he always felt were false.
There is some indication that you, Father McDonough, recommended and Roach agreed that they didn't have to follow part of the policy because the allegations in his case were old.
I'd have to look at the
Do you have any
document.
memory of that?
No, I don't have any memory of that. As I say, I'm proud of the very extensive and very painful disclosure that we required him to be part of. He was quite angry at me for the remainder of his life and told his friends that I was the one who caused his premature death. Of course, he didn't tell them that after his death, just before.
Bottom line is the Archbishop can really do what he wants. If he chooses to follow the policy, it's his choice. If he chooses not to, it's also his, correct?
He's the lawmaker. He's the lawmaker. He makes the rules.
He's the legislator, he's the decider. Right?
I'm not sure he would say like George Bush, he's the decider, but he is the legislator.
Okay. I told you I was going to go back to Waa. I'm going to ask you about Exhibit 171. And I just hand it over to you. And you recognize this one? Waa was living with you, and you're kind of witnessing a bunch of stuff that he's doing. Did you tell me earlier that you didn't think that he had actually abused the kids?
In the 1990s, at one point, I began to question the abuse. This certainly, for as far as I was concerned, absolutely put the exclamation points on the abuse.
Well, at the time that you began to question the abuse, the Archdiocese had already received at least 4 reports and 1 lawsuit that had been settled concerning Waa and his misconduct, correct? With kids.
Yes, and I believe that the report from the family member came from the young man with whom there was a settlement. I may be wrong in that. So it was a family member who was reported. This is back in the 90s, when I thought that there was some reason to doubt at least that they were prosecutable in church law, maybe even not true. This of course removed all doubt from my mind.
How much longer did Waa stay with you after you prepared this memorandum, Exhibit 171 of January 16, 2003?
I don't recall, but it was not a long time thereafter.
Well, is that months, weeks, or years?
Certainly was not years. It may have been weeks or a month or so till he moved into his mother's home.
So was this a thing for you that cinched it, that Waa was a risk and a hazard to children?
This certainly removed all my doubts.
And the doubts you had before that were based entirely upon the fact that one of the relatives of one of the kids had planted in your idea that that one may not have happened.
That 2 of them may not have happened because they were friends. The other one, and one the fact on which I won the conviction and his removal from priesthood, involved birthday spankings on a naked bottom. I will say that it required a certain amount of legal creativity to make that into a crime that would merit removal, and I'm glad it worked.
Well, Waa having a kid run around his desk naked 14 times and masturbate into a plastic baggie and then taking the plastic baggie and put it into the desk would be sexual abuse.
Absolutely.
And you learned that that's what Waa was alleged to have done with one kid.
And it was the sister of that kid.
And you also learned that there were other kids that he had in his car, both a boy and a girl, who he would have them engage in sex with one another, as he would be in the front seat masturbating. You learned about that too, didn't you?
I don't recall that one. I don't know that it wasn't true, I just don't recall it.
Okay.
Shall I
But
give this to,
171, when you heard what he was saying, while he was living with you, cinched it for you then. That was,
yes, certainly.
but you had doubts until then, so he was pretty much on the down low.
Well,
Rejected the form.
yeah, I had doubts until then. Nonetheless, he was operating under a restricted ministry. And remember that he had been widely exposed in media reports in the end of the 1980s and the first portion of the 1990s. His history was widely discussed in the St. Paul paper. I also met with parishioners in the parish at which he was then serving.
Well, you know that I'm familiar with the media reports
course.
because I generated them, right? Right, Father? You know that.
I wasn't always certain that you generated them, but
Well,
I appreciate
I
you
make no
saying so.
apology to you or anybody
No,
else
of
for
course
doing
not.
that. I felt it was, you know, an opportunity and obligation to warn. The question I have of you is, why was he in St. Peter Claver with you?
he was there in residence only. He never engaged in any ministry there.
And how did it come about that he ended up there?
In one of my monitoring meetings with him, because I was doing the insufficiently formal monitoring in the 1990s, but he'd expressed a concern that he was about to lose the residence he was in. I don't recall where that was. I had a room available.
Gerald Funchen is another priest that is now on the radar and has been before, but in 1992, did you learn the chancellor from Indiana, a place where he had worked, Bob Sell, reported that Funchen, a priest who had been working in this archdiocese, had admitted that he might have abused 50 kids. Do you recall receiving that information?
You know, I don't recall much about Funchen. I believe he was a religious order fellow, was he?
He was. He's
and then who joined? Did he die? Did he join the
But he was St.
diocese
Adelius.
there? Yes. Okay.
St. Adelius in the archdiocese. So he had to be serving under the supervision of this archbishop and with the permission of this archbishop and his religious superior.
Do you remember when that was? I don't recall the matter.
Was in the 90s.
That he was at St. Odelius,
Yes.
or that the complaint?
Well, in 1992, Bob Sell, the chancellor, records that he admits to having perhaps abused as many as 50 kids.
Yeah, I don't recall that number. That's, of course, horrific. I believe he was present in the archdiocese, though a decade or more before that.
That same memo says that they should refer the matter to you to do the calculation for the criminal statute of limitations to see if he could be prosecuted. Were you the go-to guy to determine what the criminal statute of limitations was?
I don't have the memo, so.
Did you ever make an effort to keep priests, whether it's Funchen or others, from being prosecuted and let the clock run out so that they would not be prosecuted and made public?
Absolutely not.
Was that done in the case of Adamson?
Absolutely not. Not on my part. I can't say about anybody else. That's when I was a young priest and then away at school.
If there are documents in these files where the calculation for criminal prosecution is being made by officials, if it's not you, other officials, why is such a calculation being made?
I can't speak to what other officials may have been thinking. Let me just recall again that in 1988 or 89, we'd met with the sex crimes unit leader in St. Paul, and then in the early 90s, spoken with the district or the county attorneys. So I'm sure we were calculating, is this something that I would have been calculating, is this something that these people will take a report from us on?
Do you agree, Father McDonough, that the policies and practices and particularly the practices employed by this archdiocese when it comes to the protection of children and the choices made to protect the offenders have been both dangerous and dreadful?
Would you specify a time period?
From 1980 to the present.
I would say that during the period, and I know it personally only really from '87, I believe that we got better and better at it all the time. I can't speak to the last several years because I was not privy to all of the information, but I think this diocese was a real leader and worked very hard to protect children.
A leader compared to some other dioceses.
Certainly.
You're using that comparison, but
Certainly.
not compared to any other institution.
Actually, compared to most every other institution, public
name-
school districts.
Can you name an institution that keeps lists of offenders and keeps them in active ministry and does not disclose what they know to the public? Any other institution that does such a thing?
Object to the form of misstating evidence in this case.
Besides the Roman
I don't,
Catholic Church.
I don't think that that's a fair characterization of what this archdiocese did in the time to which I can speak. I understand anecdotally that, for example, the New York City Public Schools did this, and I believe you spoke to this in a publicly televised presentation about the horrific negligence on the part of public schools for disciplining, naming, dismissing, seeing to the prosecution of teachers. That's you're one of the experts in that regard.
Yeah, I'm not sure about your characterization of my comments, but you know that's not an issue here. What's the issue here?
I think the time is up here. What is our time?
At 1:14:36.
Did you just declare time?
You have 24 seconds.
Let me ask you this, Father. You've been involved in a lot of these cases and employed a lot of practices over the years. Do you yourself have regrets about the way you handled your obligations to the children as Vicar General and as the delegate for Safe Environment?
I regret, especially in the earliest years that I was working, that we were still working with an outdated and now clearly dangerous assumption about rehabilitation for such men. I regret that deeply. I feel good about the work that we were doing already by the early 1990s.
Do you believe that I have exaggerated the risk that has been posed by the practices of the Archdiocese of St. Paul, Minneapolis?
I believe that there's some exaggeration on your part,
Can you
particularly as
give me one example?
I think our time is up. Is our time up, sir?
We're at 1:16:06.
Can you give me one example?
Time's up.
yeah, sorry, I think we're done. Huh?